Hey, this is Josh Close, and I'm going to quickly show how to comp depth of field and 3D motion blur inside of Nuke using passes. The benefit of using passes instead of rendering these things in 3D is that it will greatly reduce your render times. If you were to render the 3D motion blur and the 3D depth of field inside of your 3D application like Maya or 3D Max or something like that, it can have a very serious impact on your render times. So it's common to use passes to get these effects, and when you have these passes inside a Nuke, this is how you comp them together. What I have over here is a multi-channel EXR sequence, and this multi-channel EXR contains these passes here, the beauty, diffuse, all these other passes, and the ones that we're focusing on for this tutorial are the 3D vector, which is this pass right here, and the depth of field. Now we're going to do the depth of field using a separate pass to demonstrate that way as well. So I will go ahead and get started. The first thing that we need to do is set up the depth of field. Now the depth of field right now is just RGB data. It's just in the RGB channel. So what we need to do is put that into the depth channel, and the way that you do that is apply a shuffle node. Now the shuffle node allows you to shuffle any channel in whatever it's plugged into to any channel that you want. So for our purposes, we're going to shuffle the RGB of this depth channel into a different channel that makes more sense to us. For this tutorial, we will just add it to the depth channel. So we now have our red channel of our depth field into the Z depth. Now we need to combine that with the RGB data in here. So the node that you'll need to use to combine them together is the shuffle copy node. Now what shuffle copy does is what I was just talking about. It will take these two pipelines of data and combine them into one, so they both exist in this little pipeline that we have going here. Input 1 goes to our depth of field pass that we shuffled into Z. So we will go into the shuffle copy and go into channel 1 here, and we will take the depth information and we will send that right back out as depth information. So it now exists in this pipeline as depth data. And now for channel 2, since we want just the RGB, we will take the RGB information and send it right back out as RGB. So now at this point in the script, both of them exist. They're put together with the RGB and the Z. So now we can go ahead and add our Z blur node. I hit tab and then just typed Z to get to this menu here. And then I add the Z blur to it. And the purpose for adding them together is to keep everything in a nice little pipeline here, if your passes are separate. If they're already contained in the multi-channel EXR, you don't have to do this operation here. But since it is separate, it requires this extra shuffle and shuffle copy nodes. And now that we've done that, our Z blur will attach to the depth.z channel, and it will extract the depth information from there. You won't see anything yet because we need to set our focal plane, our depth of field, and our size. So the first thing I'll do is I'll just kick up the size of the depth of field, and you could go through and kind of guess where your information should be and decide what's in focus and what's not, but an easier way would be to hit this focal plane setup button, and what that does is gives you an extremely exaggerated view of what you're doing. So this green line represents what's in focus, the perfectly in focus areas, and this is pretty shallow. This is probably more shallow than we want for the depth of field. Things would start to fall off very quickly. The blue and the red represent the fall off zones for the depth of field. So what we can do is we can go up to this depth of field option and we can raise it up, and that will make the depth of field a little larger, and we'll move it up so what's nearer to us is in focus. That's probably about right. And this is just a preview, so this focal plane setup is just for preview reasons, so we can uncheck that once we have it set how we want, and then you will see the depth of field effect in action. You can hit D to disable the node, and you'll see what exactly it's doing. It's falling off in the way that we would expect. And now we can go ahead and add the vector blur. And since our vector information is already contained in our multi-channel EXR over here, you can find that right here. It's the MV3 channel. We will use that channel inside of the vector blur node. So inside of vector blur, under UV channels, we will need to set it to this MV3.MoGraph. And if you rendered your motion blur as a separate pass, you would do it the same way. You would have to shuffle it into some channel, like the motion channel. You would shuffle it into the motion channel and then send it into the UV channels, and that's what vector blur would look like. But since in this case it is included in the EXR, multi-channel EXR, vector blur can already see it because it already exists in our little pipeline here. So we will set our UV channels to the vector blur data, and you'll already see that it's working. It's really subtle right now. I'll get zoomed in pretty close here, and you can see the edges start to blur around there, or maybe on this side it's a little easier to tell. But our vector information is already being applied. If you want more blur, you can raise this multiply option right here. And what this does is it multiplies, well, you can read the tooltip, multiplies the U and the V channels. You can raise this up to get a little bit more motion blur out of it if you want that. Maybe that's a little bit too much. But that is pretty much all that is involved in setting this up. It's important to note that you should do the vector blur after the Z blur, because our depth of field has a very defined edge. It's very crisp and clean. And what occurs if you do it in the opposite order, I'll show you what that looks like. We will quickly apply our vector blur. Actually, we will apply it right away to the beginning. Our vector blur is working as expected, and now we will shuffle after that. So we've added our depth information after the fact, after it's already been vector blurred. And here is the issue that occurs when you do it this way. What happens is it will blur beyond the edge of this camera. You'll see that the motion blur, it blurs out the edges of it, but the depth of field is still based on this clean edge. So when you blur it, it will keep the edge here, but all of the motion blur that has gone beyond that edge will immediately fall off into the depth of field, and it gives you a very strange sort of halo looking effect, and it's not necessarily what you want. You'll want to apply the Z blur beforehand, because the vector blur will account for that. Like, it will just blur everything afterward. As you can see here, this is already it already has depth of field on it, and it will blur it afterward, and you don't get the weird effect on the outside. And that is the more correct way to do it. That is pretty much all that's involved in getting these two things to work inside of Nuke. So if you have any questions on this tutorial, feel free to email me or comment on the video, or send me a message, or any number of ways that you can find to contact me. I post this tutorial along with any other tutorials that I do on my website, which is joshclose.com. If you have any tutorial requests also, if I know how to do it, I would be happy to show anyone how to work with it. So I hope this helped.